Hello, I'm Natalie. I'm a grateful recovering addict. So I think I'll just start with apologizing if I yawn, because this is way past my bedtime. I think the committee, I'm so grateful that the committee asked me to speak, but they probably thought we'll choose like a younger person because she'll be awake and she'll have all of her friends awake. But this is past my bedtime, so I'm so excited to go to bed after this. So, as I said, my name's Natalie. I'm a grateful recovering addict. I'm really honored and really am grateful that I get to speak today. I think it's one of the talents that I have that I was able to tap into, when I got clean. So when I was called and asked to speak by Sally, who's a friend of mine, primarily because we shared the same sponsor, Laura. And so we kind of connected that way. So she called and asked me to speak. And, because it's one of my talents and it's something I enjoy doing, I'm always like, yes, I'll be there. I didn't plan on coming to MRCNA on Thursday night. And, conventions are definitely more of Gabe's thing than mine. I think I went a number of years ago for the first time because I was enamored with him. And he was like, let's go. And so I went. And, as he said, as our relationship's taken a different path, it's like, okay, I see a world in which someday I'll be like, you have a good time, honey. Like, I'll come see you Saturday night for the speaker, and like, that's it. But no, I really am honored that I was asked to speak. And so when they called me and I, said, okay, what do I speak on? They're like, whatever. So the topic is Beyond Our Wildest Dreams, and I'm going to keep it up here with me because I've spoken a number of times about like miracles do happen and beyond our wildest dreams and things that are in the same vein. So I want to remember what this MRCNA's theme is, but it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, share your story and beyond our wildest dreams will just organically come out. So that's what I'm going to do, is just share my story with you. July is always like a bittersweet month for me because July was when I went to rehab 6 years ago, this July. I entered rehab July 11th, 2012. Stayed for a month. And really rehab is when my introduction to Narcotics Anonymous started. I didn't know about 12-step programs. I didn't know about a recovery community. So I'm always grateful this time of year. It's the irony in those of us who have been to rehab can't fucking wait to leave when we're there. It's like every day, get me out. And then you're out and you're like, I could go back. I mean, it wasn't that bad. It was kind of nice, especially the rehab I went to, because I had to go to like the nicest one to feel like I wasn't a junkie. So send me to the nicest rehab, and then I'm not like, don't really have a problem. We were just up at my aunt and uncle's lake house, and my brother was up there with my sister-in-law, and we were just in the car the other night together, the four of us, talking about me as a child growing up, and just how unruly I was is probably the best word to describe it. I was just kind of crazy and chaotic, and whenever I got bored, I just created chaos. I don't remember how Gabe put it, but he put it pretty well. And so I've done that since I was 5, and I carry it into now, present time. And so I think that speaks a little bit to just my addiction and how sometimes I struggle to just be. So I grew up in a pretty normal household. I was privileged by all, intents and purposes. I had a pretty privileged life. I went to band camp, and, my parents were well educated, and my mom's a nurse, and my dad owned his own business, and I had one brother, and we went camping, and we had a really good life. I think, the one thing that we can just get out of the way is that I definitely have the genes of addiction in my family. Which now that I am a therapist, I know that that's like 40 to 60% of what addiction is genetics. And I think that our society minimizes that. Sometimes I'll be talking to clients and it's not until much later in the conversation are they like, yeah, my dad was a raging alcoholic or my mom had a really bad drug problem. And it's like, I don't know. For me, it doesn't excuse the behavior, but it explains it and makes me not feel like I'm an island on my own. And so I really hold that close, that that's how I was brought up. My dad, was an alcoholic, is an alcoholic. My mom was an alcoholic. My mom's uncle was an alcoholic, killed himself from the disease of addiction. And so it's really been in my family for decades and generations. And so I grew up with two functioning alcoholics, and for us, that meant that Monday through Thursday they didn't drink. And then Friday through Saturday, they usually got shit-faced. And, my mom's addiction, my dad would binge drink and then he would go pass out. My mom just didn't stop drinking. I mean, she would drink from the minute she opened wine up. We're talking like 9 bottles later. And so because they were functioning alcoholics, my family knew, but nobody talked about it. And I remember, being around 10 and my parents drinking and driving. And there was a time when they did that, regularly. We have a cabin up north, and it was kind of part of the culture. We would go out on the boat and they would pour alcohol into their coffee cups, like their mugs, travel cups, and then just like drink throughout, and we would drive to go from the boat to the cabin and the drinking would continue. And we never talked about it, but my anxiety started at a really young age. I think that's probably the number one thing I remember from that chaos is just feeling anxious and scared. My brother processed it differently than I did, which is another important facet of the disease of addiction, is that just because your siblings don't have it doesn't mean that it's not genetics. That's a really big misnomer and a really big myth that a lot of people have, and the easiest thing to say is that you don't have the exact same genes that your siblings do. You don't have the same hair color or eye color or what have you necessarily. So he just would just go to sleep. It didn't seem to make him anxious. He seemed to kind of just be oblivious to the chaos. And I seemed to be really in touch with it. I think that something that I have and that other addicts have is sometimes the sixth sense to tap into energy, spirituality, emotions that are going on that other people don't really process. Like we can really feel those feelings pretty strongly and they can affect us. And so I was really affected by it. But I think that more than being affected by the drinking was the secrecy that I was affected by. We never talked about it. So they drink and drive, and I remember telling my grandparents that they did this or what have you, and nobody said anything. There was judgment, but nobody intervened. And so I grew up with that like learned conditioning aspect of when you're stressed out and you're frustrated or you're bored or you're trying to relieve stress from the week, you drink. And I also learned that it was just something we don't really talk about, just do it, and we don't really talk about it. And it really made it difficult for me to tease apart, how can you have a beautiful, wonderful, privileged family that's healthy in a lot of regards with so much dysfunction? Like, we want this black and white. It's either completely fucked up or it's completely amazing, right? And so many of us fall in between where it's a little bit shitty but pretty good too. And it can make it hard because sometimes you feel like, what am I complaining about? I have it really good. This isn't that bad, And I think that was a lot of my life growing up was, my mom was abusive. She was physically abusive, but nothing that would get CPS called, And so it was like hard, because we hear stories that are just like horrific stories and we think that if we don't fall into that, then A, we don't measure up, and B, just don't even talk about it. It's just part of life, right? But now I know today that like it wasn't okay. And, I'm also aware of the likelihood of me to act in certain ways because I was brought up that way. And I think being aware of it is one of the huge ways that we break the cycle. So grew up with that. Did some experimentation with drugs and drinking. Always got in trouble. I mean, I was like the kid that was grounded all the time. My parents just were went from a day or a weekend to, by the time I was in high school, it was I was grounded for months at a time. I mean, just months at a time. At that point, I feel like something's not working. Your punishment method is not working if you just have to ground someone for a whole year. So I was grounded for months at a time, and really the black sheep of the family. My brother really followed the rules. He was in prep classes. One aspect of my family that's important is that education was really important to us. Higher education was really important to us. In terms of intelligence or education, I didn't really measure up to my brother. Like I said, he was always in the prep classes, and I was always tested for the prep classes and never got into them. And then when I got into early junior high, I was actually in remedial math, which, lucky enough, math was the one subject my dad cared the most about. And so that was a double whammy for him or me, that I couldn't measure up in the one subject he cared so much about. So I knew that education was important. I always felt like it didn't measure up. Grew up with the disease of addiction, with my parents being addicts. My relationship with my dad was incredibly dysfunctional. He didn't know how to raise a daughter. And he really put a lot of, he projected a lot of his fears in me. And I don't know the best way to talk about it, because I am still processing it. But, he really looked at women as sexual beings, and he was terrified that people would look at me as a sexual being. And so that really drove our relationship. When I started getting older and hitting puberty and being interested in guys, he had no skills to communicate with me. He basically said, put on a tarp, hide your body, and if you talk to a guy, you're a slut. And that was hard. I mean, it just shut our relationship down completely. There was no communication. I felt like he never heard me. I oftentimes felt like when I was talking to him, he would say what he had to say and then shut the door, and I would just be screaming in the room wanting to be heard and was never heard. And that's carried into our relationship today. We still don't have a wonderful relationship. I don't know that we ever will. There was so much damage that was done for so many years of my life that, to say that I'm holding on to resentments with that is really an understatement. So I go to college. I go to Michigan State, and And my parents went to Michigan State. They met at Michigan State, and so our family wasn't really too divided. It's getting more divided now, but in terms of that, we were all go green, go white. So I went to Michigan State, and my first year at Michigan State, pills to help you study started being passed around and started being popular. And I mean, from there, the rest is history. It happened so fast. And, that drug for me, that particular drug for me is was my greatest love. Because it like everything, I mean, it's the same thing for anyone. It filled that void that we all had, right? I feel like we all have a void, and that void is constructed of unique stories, right, of what we need to have filled. And what I needed to have filled was this belief that I was good enough, that I could do it, that I was smart enough, and I needed to have confidence that I think my relationship with my dad stripped away from me, that confidence. So I found this drug, and it gave me confidence, and it made me feel like I was really smart and I could do things. And from there, I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't taking this medication as my friends were taking this medication. They would take one or half of one and then not take it again for a week or two. And I immediately was buying people's whole scripts out. Give me the whole thing, give me the whole thing. And so pretty quickly the lies started of me telling people I'm selling this, it's not all for me, when really I swear to God I didn't sell one ever. The thought that people sell drugs is crazy to me. Why wouldn't you just take them all? So that bled into other prescription drugs and the use of other things. And the part about it being prescription drugs I think is important because I thought that I was different. I thought that I wasn't a junkie. I thought that I wasn't my mom or my dad. I didn't have any concept that the disease of addiction could be anything, any drug. And I remember thinking that at least it's not alcohol, that I have control over it because it's a prescription, that I'm not, as bad as everyone else. I'm never going to be homeless. I'm never going to be, a degenerative, whatever. So I did that for a long time, and it just became progressive, and it took over my whole life. I mean, it started with using it for studying, and then it bled into cleaning and waking up and showering. And, I needed something else to help me go to sleep. I did really bad harm on my body. I had to take so much Tylenol PM to go to sleep. And, I remember one night I still was wide awake. My brain was fully functioning, and I had to go to the bathroom. And so I went to get out of bed to go to the bathroom, and I couldn't walk because I had taken so much Tylenol PM that my body was paralyzed. And I gave myself restless leg syndrome. It was really bad. And so I'm okay, screw the Tylenol PM. That's not going to work. And so then I moved into other prescription drugs. And I remember feeling at any time my heart might stop, that feeling of I might not make it. But the thought of not doing this never came across my mind. I didn't feel like I could not do it. In the nights when my heart's beating so fast and my breathing is labored, I'll never forget that stuff. So I got kicked out of school. That goes without saying. Michigan State eventually didn't want me. I was in the School of Social Work. I was going to get my BSW. I knew from freshman year that I wanted to get my BSW, my Bachelor's in Social Work. And the School of Social Work eventually dismissed me. They didn't dismiss me because they thought I was using drugs. They dismissed me because I was crazy, and I was crazy because I was using drugs. So eventually they dismissed me, and at that time I was living at my grandfather's home in Grand Ledge, and he had recently passed away, and I was living in this big-ass house by myself, kicked out of school. I spent 6 months going through the appeal process to get back in because my denial told me that I didn't do anything wrong, and I deserved to be back in the school. And obviously, eventually, I lost that fight. So once I didn't have anything, once I didn't have school anymore, and I'm living at this house by myself, and my grandfather had passed, and I just, for me, I felt like I didn't have anything. And I think probably around this time, I started realizing that my dependency on drugs was, I couldn't sustain it. And I remember having this thought of, at that time I was 21, you're either going to have to go the rest of your life taking 30 pills a day and having to find them every fucking day, or you're going to have to stop. Those are the only two choices, and I think that's when I realized, I can't do this for the rest of my life. The drugs made me suicidal. I definitely had domestic violence with the boyfriend at that time, primarily me being the perpetrator of violence. I was fucking crazy. And, so there was domestic violence, and I was suicidal, didn't want to live. And so I went to a rehab in Grand Rapids, and I was just going to do intensive outpatient. And I had to walk through the inpatient wing to get to the outpatient wing. And I got to the outpatient wing, and they're like, you know, what do you use? How many drugs do you use? And I told them like a third of what I do. And they're like, holy shit, you need to go inpatient. That's really bad. And I'm like, you know, of course I didn't tell you how much I was really using. That would be fucking crazy. So because I had just walked through the inpatient unit, I remember I left there, went and found, you know, my boyfriend at the time, and was like, there's no way I'm going to rehab there. So if they think I need rehab, I'm going to find a different rehab. And, you know, this is kind of a funny part of my story. It was around the same time that I watched a Demi Lovato special on MTV, and she had gone to rehab. And I was like, you know, they had like equestrian therapy and horses and massages going on and these really nice beds. And I was like, I'm going there. And so I called them up. I'm like, do you take Aetna insurance? And they're like, yeah, we do. And I'm like, great. So, you know, I called my mom. I found a place. The other reason I loved this place to go to was that the three things that they said that they treated were eating disorders, substance use, and mental health. And at that time, from as far as my family was concerned, my issue was mental health. I was too afraid to tell them that it was drugs. I would rather have them think that I had mental health issues than a substance use issue. So I was like, okay, I know that it's probably substance use, but I'm going to go here, and then I can go under the guise of mental health. So it took me about a month to get in there. Of course, they called me. They're like, we have a bed. I'm like, okay, I'll be there. And then I just never showed up the first time, of course. And so then I call them back crying, please still take me. I really, they're like, what happened? I'm like, I don't know. Basically when I was supposed to be in Chicago, I was laying on the floor of my grandpa's house. Like, why? I don't know, So I ended up getting in there. It's called Timberline Knolls, and it was a beautiful place, and they opened up my eyes to recovery, to Narcotics Anonymous. I don't even know if they knew what was wrong with me. Now that I'm a therapist and I realize how insurance works and that you have to ask insurance to keep the client there, I didn't really give them anything. I don't know why they thought I needed to be there. I said I had a small cannabis issue. I never once told them that I used drugs. And they're like, we're going to just write you down as like a mild cannabis issue. I was like, okay, sounds good. They took a drug screen when I got there and they never said anything to me. And so I'm like, man, maybe I didn't test positive for anything, So I knew I wanted to get help, but I wasn't sure that the way to get help would be total abstinence. For me, I wasn't sure, right? And I think that a lot of us come into this recovery process feeling like if I can put one of my 10 toes in and get cured, that's probably the best way to do it. And then we quickly learn that, no, you need to put all 10 toes in if you want a life of recovery, and you're still not going to be cured. That sometimes takes a while, and that journey can be bumpy. And so for me, it was. So I go to rehab. I don't tell anyone that I use drugs. And they're like, we don't really know what to do with you. You have mild cannabis issue. We'll put you in NA meetings. Thank God, because, it was really through rehab and through going to meetings that I realized that it's not always the disheveled homeless man under the bridge who's scary, clutching a bag. And I didn't fucking know that because our society doesn't talk about this stuff, that it can be successful people. It can be lawyers and doctors and, people who have education. For me, the rehab was really important because it was all women. And I needed to relate to other women who were going through the same process that I was. So I see other women who I look up to who come from a similar socioeconomic standing that I do, have a similar education that I do. And it's like, if you can struggle with this and it's okay for you to talk about it, then it's going to be okay for me to talk about it. And I'll never forget that weight being lifted off my shoulders of just being able to come out of the closet and be like, yeah, I fucking abuse this shit, a lot. And the fact that I talked my doctors into giving me prescriptions and they were doing that all, my mom was just mystified when I told her that as a nurse, all the prescriptions you were helping me get was exactly what I didn't need. And of course we tried, before I went to rehab, we tried the psychiatry, we tried the geographic change. I went to a psychiatrist, I got put on 12 different medications, and I remember the doctor's like, do you count your pills every time you leave the house? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, then you have OCD. I'm going to give you a medication for OCD. And I was like, okay, I must have OCD. And now that I talk to other addicts, it's like, we all fucking do that, all right? And then you drive down the driveway and you're like, maybe I don't have enough. And then you go back inside and you get a little more. It's not OCD, it's just addiction, in my case. So, go to rehab. I'm clean for 30 days off everything. I thought I just needed a detox period, a jail period, and then I could handle it. And so I go back and I do intensive outpatient programming, and they set me up with my psychiatrist to follow up on my meds. And I go back to my psychiatrist and I say, I just went to this place for mental health issues. I'm having trouble concentrating. Can you give me anything? And she writes me my drug of choice. And, at that time, the disease had progressed to the point that I was taking the whole prescription, the whole month in 1 to 2 days. And so I'm like, if I cannot take it in 1 to 2 days, then I don't have a problem. And, of course, I took it in 1 to 2 days. And at this point, I was living at home with my parents, and so I didn't have anything to help take the edge off. And it was fucking hell. Like, it was so bad to be strung out and that stimulated and that high and that awake, especially for someone who loves sleep. So I didn't take it again for a while. And when I got kicked out of school and I went to rehab, the next kind of plan of action was to go back home with my parents. And so I went back home with my parents in Coopersville, Michigan. And, they were so gracious enough to allow me to come back into their house. And kind of from day one, I was doing therapy twice a week. I was lucky enough to find a wonderful therapist. I did therapy twice a week. And I wanted to get out of the house so bad because I was 22 living at home. And so I went to NA meetings like every day just to get out of the house and be away from them, and probably to be able to smoke cigarettes, because that would never have been okay with my family. Like, we don't smoke cigarettes. We just drink all the time. So which my mom's a closet smoker. So, whatever. So I probably went to get out of the house, be away from my parents, and smoke cigarettes. And, whatever. It worked. I got connected. I got friends. I asked the prettiest person in the room to sponsor me, and you know how that went. It didn't go well. She's not still my sponsor. Not that the prettiest person in the room can't have good recovery, but my motives were off, and so I just think spiritually and energetically that was just destined to not work out. And so during my first 9 months in recovery, I'm like, okay, I'm going to put down my drug of choice, but I'm still going to drink and smoke weed. Of course, duh. And, I'm like, those weren't a problem for me. I didn't have an issue with that. And now that I'm a therapist, one of the biggest issues I see with people who are new in recovery, especially with narcotics and drugs, is that, I had a friend in recovery who said we didn't have an alcohol problem until we didn't have drugs. And then we very quickly had an alcohol problem. And so for people who are early in recovery, they spent so much energy and time using their drug of choice that they never maybe experimented with alcohol. And that was definitely my story, was I never wanted alcohol. That totally fucked up the high I was trying to get. And so when I put down my drug of choice, I'm like, well, I haven't proven to myself that I can't handle alcohol, so maybe I can. And of course, my mom's drinking at this time, and she's like, it's probably fine. And I thought that you guys were a cult, and I wasn't, entirely willing to surrender everything. To this day, I can be incredibly rebellious. Gabe jokes that he'll always say I won't be wrangled. Whenever I do something that's I'm just going to do this, fuck you. It's okay, we know you won't be wrangled to do anything that we ask you to do. And so, I came into this program and you guys were you got to do this. And I'm like, no, I'll do this, but not that. And so I had this sponsor and she wasn't really working out with me. And so about 8 months into the program, she stopped sponsoring me. I don't know how it ended, but it ended. And, so I don't have a sponsor, and I'm still drinking, and I'm still occasionally smoking weed. And in those 9 months, alcohol and weed did not become an issue for me. That's my story, is that for those 9 months, it wasn't an issue for me. But I left myself really vulnerable because I wasn't completely committed to this program. And so about 9 months into the program, April, 5.5 years ago, I was studying for this fucking Spanish class. You know, I got kicked out of school, and so I'm like, all right, I'm going to go back. I'm going to take one Spanish class from Grand Valley, and that will kind of like get me going, right? Grease the wheels. I'll be able to prove to myself that I can go back to school. And I was not doing well in the Spanish class at all. Like, I didn't have any idea what they were saying. We had to write papers in Spanish, and I didn't even know how to, like, write a sentence in Spanish. I was so out of my league. And so I got in trouble for plagiarizing a couple of times. This professor was, like, really on her shit. And I didn't even mean to plagiarize. I mean, it's just, like, I wasn't doing really well at the paper, and, like, I'd find a paragraph here on Google, and so whatever. So she was like, you know, like, I'm going to report you to the school, you know, if you do this again or whatever. So I'm like, okay, I have one final. I have to study. I don't know what I'm doing. All right. And I just opened this cupboard at my aunt's house, and my cousin had a prescription to my drug of choice, and she was studying overseas, and I opened the cabinet, and there it was. And so it was kind of like this perfect storm where I was at my weakest, most vulnerable point because I didn't have a sponsor. I wasn't working on a complete program, and I was struggling with school, intelligence. Like, that's my biggest thing, right? And so, of course, I took them all. And that was the last time I used, April 23rd, 2013, 5.5 years ago. And, you know, after I took the drugs, it was at that time that I pretty much went right back to the program because I had made connections for those first 5 months. I had people who were like, it's okay, come back, just tell us. And so I did. I went back. I told them. I was like, okay, I got to find a new sponsor. I found my sponsor, whom I still have today, Laura, and, you know, she had a Michigan State sweatshirt on, and she swore a lot in the meetings, and I was like, I don't know much about you, but you seem pretty cool. And she's one of my best friends. You know, she's going to stand up at my wedding, and she's really, like, transformed my life. She's so amazing for me, and I feel so lucky that I found somebody, a sponsor that I can grow with. I think that that's so important. I think that sometimes the expectation that NA puts on people to find a sponsor, I get, because it's like, okay, grab your lifeboat right now. Like, grab your swimmies because you don't know how to swim, and let's just keep you afloat. But the fact of the matter is we're going to probably outgrow our first sponsor. And that's okay. And so I just really want to tell people, tell women especially, that if that happens, it's okay. And your sponsor doesn't have to be your best friend. Like, their only requirement is to walk you through the 12 steps. And if you find a sponsor that you love and you can work out with, and, you know, they're willing to stand up at your wedding, and you get together and you chat and you know, you're best friends, then that's like a total added bonus, but that's not a requirement. So I recommit to the program, and it was kind of at that time that I was like, all right, I guess my way wasn't working, and I just have to do it the program's way. Of course, I tried to do it my way first because, you know, a lot of us are hard-headed, and my ego was like, I can do this my own way. I don't have to do it your way. But I think, you know, because I still struggle today with, is alcohol a problem for me? Would alcohol have been a problem for me? Or marijuana? And the fact of the matter is that what you guys provide me with, what Narcotics Anonymous provides me with, is a safety net and this all 360 protection, right? And the only way I can get that 360 protection is if I'm willing to give everything up. Because if I say I only want your help for my drug of choice, but I don't want your help for these other things, then I'm only asking for like 100-degree or 90-degree protection, right? And then you're just like, it's just like luck, you know, if you go through the rest of your life with only 90-degree protection and don't ever pick anything else up, but probably most of us will if we only have 90-degree protection. And so if I really wanted like 360 protection from you guys, I needed to be willing to not do anything, right? And so I did that, and, you know, it worked for me. So I started working steps with Laura and, you know, meeting with her like every other week. I moved out of my parents' house. My mom's drinking was really bad at that time. I mean, she was like 9 bottles of wine and would hide them so that when my dad came home from his weekends up north, he wouldn't see it. I was so angry with her. She never kept any of her commitments or her word. And so the healthiest thing for me to do was to move out of her house. So I moved in with my aunt and uncle in East Grand Rapids, and I went back to school at Michigan State. And so we talk about like beyond our wildest dreams. That was probably the first thing was staying clean, and I was able to do that. The second thing was going back to school and completing my bachelor's degree. I only had 1 semester left. The School of Social Work. How long do I have? 11:30? Okay. The School of Social Work said we won't take you back. And so I got my degree in sociology and finished school in 1 semester. And I think, I don't know who our speaker was at 7 o'clock. I can't remember her name. Anna. Okay, so Anna said this thing about going back to school, and I really related to it about all of a sudden, like, I didn't use drugs, and I was getting 4 points, and I was doing really well in school, and it was so necessary for me to build that self-esteem that I can do it without drugs. And so I 4-pointed, my last semester, graduated with my bachelor's, didn't get to go back to the School of Social Work, and that's one of the consequences, of my active use. And I got a job as a foster care worker, and I moved out of my aunt and uncle's, and I moved into an apartment, and I was like living on my own. I was paying bills. I was a foster care worker. I had a job, 40-hour-a-week job, and it was really an amazing learning curve for me. It was a really beautiful time for me to like learn about self-care. I really got into yoga at that time, and just focusing on myself and like what I need and creating a schedule. Was important to me. So I was a foster care worker for about 4 years. I had a few relationships in recovery with men, and that was helpful in that it taught me what I want and don't want in relationships. It taught me what it's like to be in a relationship with someone and have it end and still need to come back to the rooms. To see them here when we've broken up can be awkward, but like it's not an option to not come back. I'm definitely not going to let them push me out of the rooms. And so about, 3 years, 2.5 years into my recovery, I had a relationship that ended, and Gabe had just moved from Ann Arbor to Grand Rapids because he also had a relationship that had ended. And, we became friends, and he helped me like with my application to get into grad school. I decided after a few years that like, okay, I'm going to go back to grad school. I'm going to finally get my degree in social work. That's what I wanted to do. And, so he helped me get into that, and he listened to me while I was crying over this boyfriend. I never cried in front of him over this guy, but I definitely complained about him. And, he was there for me during that time. And so we really created a friendship for a number of months. And he was really into Narcotics Anonymous. That was something that was so important to him. And so my relationship, just by default of kind of being next to him, my relationship with Narcotics Anonymous flourished. And so eventually we moved in together. I got accepted to Grand Valley's social work program, and I just recently graduated with my degree, with my master's in social work in April. And that was another huge success for me, was to go back to school and get the social work degree I always wanted and do it clean, without any drugs, and to learn how to balance recovery with school. So I just recently, after I graduated, got kind of the job of my dreams at a rehab in Grand Rapids. And so I run an intensive outpatient program as a substance use therapist in Grand Rapids. And I love it. I feel so blessed to be able to work with people in recovery. My newest challenge, in this chapter of my life is how do I balance doing recovery all day and then go to meetings? It's hard. It's not fucking easy. And, you know, I don't think anybody understands unless they're there. And it is different. It's slightly different, but it's a lot the same too. And so what my involvement in NA looks like now is different, right? I sponsor 3 women, and I won't sponsor more than that because I can't handle giving back to people, to women in early recovery, more than 3 women at that time. Like, that's my max right now because I do so much with them all week. And so for me to keep my sanity and keep my recovery, I need to be able to have those boundaries and, like, listen to them. I go to meetings. But then again, you know, I go to meetings and my clients are there. And so that's been an interesting thing to navigate. One of the things I love doing is speaking. And so I'm like, okay, you know, when a service opportunity comes up that I can do, and it doesn't drain me of everything, then, like, I need to step up and do it. One of the probably top 3 biggest gifts of my recovery journey is that probably 3 years ago, my mom got sober. And, you know, I don't think she would have gotten sober if I hadn't gotten sober. You know, I didn't want to talk to her about it, but at that point she was falling downstairs and it was really bad. And I remember my dad came to me and my brother came to me and they're like, you need to talk to her. You need to save our family. You need to do this. And I was like, shit, like, I've got all my baggage about this. I've never talked to her about it. And I just felt like it was one of those times where I got to suit up and show up. And so I talked to her about Narcotics Anonymous. I didn't tell her, you got to get sober, you can't live this way. I just said, my life is so amazing today. And, like, it's through Narcotics Anonymous and putting down drugs and alcohol that I've been able to have a wonderful life and live everything beyond my wildest dreams. And she just listened to me, and we walked down the beach. We were on a vacation in the Bahamas, and she, like, cried while we were walking down the beach, just, like, silently. And I just hugged her, and we never really talked about it again. And she called me about a month later and said, I just went to an AA meeting. And, you know, that was about 2.5, 3 years ago, and she's been sober since. So, you know, when I struggle with this idea of, do I have a problem with alcohol? Did I jip myself by getting part of this program that doesn't let me do anything? You know, would I have been able to be a functioning drinker? I think to myself, maybe, but she definitely wouldn't have stopped drinking if I hadn't stopped drinking. And if you had asked me 10 years ago, would it be worth you putting down alcohol if your mom gets sober? I would have said yes, 1,000 times over. So it doesn't really matter. Like, you know, sometimes these gifts come to us in ways that we don't expect or we can't quite understand. And so, yeah, with 5.5, you know, years clean, I'm now a therapist with my master's degree in social work, and I'm getting married in 2 months to somebody who's in the program. Yeah, it's crazy. We just bought a house. Like, we have a fucking mortgage.
Cute house, too.
It's a cute house. And, you know, it's, like, crazy. And I think to myself sometimes that I've created the perfect storm because I have such close relationships with people who are in recovery who would never let me use. You know, being engaged to Gabe and having a best friend as my sponsor, Laura, I would lose such deep relationships if I ever chose to pick up again. And so for me today, it's not even an option. You know, I still have shitty days. I still get stressed out. There are still times when I'm like, some form of escape would be really, really nice. It's hard to be aware and clean and present all of the time. And so when I'm feeling that way and it's a struggle for me and it's difficult, I just think to myself, it's worth me going through this difficult stuff and knowing that it's going to pass to keep these deep relationships that I have. I can't imagine giving them up. And so, you know, when Gabe talked about me having a 360 program, I'll just like close with this, that for me, it is important to touch a little bit on everything, you know, to stay with my step work and doing that and being present with that. And, you know, I'm halfway through step 6 and completing step 6 is something that's really important to me. And sponsoring women is really important to me. Sharing my story is really important to me. Being connected with the community is really important to me. And so I'm so grateful that I became part of this process. I couldn't imagine my life any other way. And thanks for letting me speak.